This is the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels like they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across the table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. I am once again postponing actually getting into the namesake of this podcast for a very unique and unexpected reason. So I would have had what I call an emotional relapse this past week, and I figured it would be really beneficial to get everyone up to speed and just play out what exactly occurred and what I mean by an emotional relapse. So I promise you, we have chapter 3 of the big book coming up. Again, the namesake of this entire project. We will eventually get to it, but really this, in an odd way, is a very unexpected and valuable opportunity for me to play out exactly what happened in my life that led to this moment where I experienced this emotional relapse and found myself going back to feelings and thought patterns that, quite frankly, I haven't felt since drinking, since I was drinking. And the miracle through all of this was that despite going through what felt like an emotional setback, an emotional relapse, I never was compelled. I never had the urge to drink. I did recognize that in the past, this situation would have driven me down into a hole deeper than I can even imagine. And quite frankly, it was a little bit scary to go through and just realize how this would have cascaded into worse and worse events in my life had I not found the solution. And I'm going to walk through this as best as I can and just kind of play out the changes that have occurred. And this is probably going to be hard for people to connect with, but even going through all of the stress and suffering that we went through with our daughter prior to her birth, and then, after she was born and passed away, I never experienced an actual resentment. And that is at the root cause of what happened in this past week for me. And so this was my first time really dealing with like a clean conscience and a clean house, and then having a situation crop up in my life where I almost immediately built a resentment against individuals, against, I guess groups of people. And I am going to be as detailed but vague, at the same time vague, just because I want to absolutely respect the situation, but I do want to portray it in enough detail to give anyone who is wondering what these steps, what this process actually looks like in action, to give you basically a play-by-play of how this works. So again, I'm sure the vast majority of individuals listening know that as a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's 12 steps. And basically, you're never finished with the steps. You're always doing step work. And once you've progressed through the first 9 steps, steps 10, 11, and 12 are often regarded as maintenance steps where you have done the heavy lifting of doing a really profound and deep and honest look back at your life, doing an assessment of your shortcomings, making your amends, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And by the time that you hit steps 10, 11, 12, you do have the potential of just kind of falling into like a maintenance cycle where you're monitoring and you're paying attention and you're recognizing when a resentment in particular might be building up, and then you go back through the steps to ensure that you clear it out. Again, the analogy of a dirty house is really perfect in this case. It's like you did the heavy lifting in steps 1 through 9. You cleared out all the clutter. You got in deep. And now that you're in this maintenance mode, you're able to recognize more of the like dust settling and just kind of these smaller aspects of a resentment or a dirty house build up, so that you can ideally, if you're paying attention and truly living in active recovery, clear those resentments out as quickly as possible. So what you'll see here is just how a resentment built up very, very rapidly, in my case, last week, and how fear is so tightly coupled and tied to resentment. I'm going to cover what my early thought patterns and processes were like, because it was very shocking to find myself where I did early last week. And then I'm going to talk through the steps that I took to get to where I am today, a week out, and really feeling like 100% back to normal, and in a weird way, like more energized and focused than I was even before this all occurred. So yeah, this again is really fairly raw. So stay with me as I kind of detail the situation out. I'm going to give an overview, again, a very sweeping, broad overview of what happened. And then I will also go into the book in quite a lot of detail, I guess, within the sections that talk about resentment. So from a very high level, last week we do biannual reviews. So at roughly the 6-month period, June, July timeframe, the company basically takes a big pause. And again, I'm not even going to name my employer at this point. Definitely not going to name any coworkers' names. I respect and admire them quite a lot, but it is literally impossible to play this out without talking a little bit in detail on the situation. So from a high level, I got my mid-year performance review, and I scored low, like just flat out underperform, below expectations on a lot of items, and just overall assessment of below. And up to this point in my career, the thing I kept coming back to as I was having conversations about this was, in 12 plus years of being in the professional world, I've never received a performance review that surprised me. Like, I have commonly and often had areas of opportunity, but I had felt up to that point I was well aware and well prepared for and self-aware of those areas of opportunity, so that when we sat down at any point for these, formal reviews that wind up happening, nothing ever caught me off guard until last week. And so my initial reaction was so this occurred on Tuesday, and throughout Tuesday morning, and throughout the day on Tuesday, I found my mind like having had a large boulder slightly nudged off of the top of a hill. And my mind and the building of my resentment slowly started turning and gaining more and more momentum until Tuesday. By the time Tuesday evening rolled around, I was in a full-blown state of I guess, call it emotional disruption. But the way I genuinely like to think about it is I had an emotional relapse. So as I've talked about on this podcast extensively, I think often about how I am doing with regards to my physical fitness and prevention of relapse on the physical front, my emotional fitness and my prevention of emotional relapse on that front, and spiritual fitness and my prevention of spiritual relapse on that front. I genuinely did not have any sort of spiritual relapse. And as I said at the beginning, I did not have any desire to go and drink. But the crazy and unexpected thing that occurred Tuesday night into Wednesday morning is that I laid in bed and I realized that I was experiencing the same thought patterns, the same frame of mind in terms of falling into this state of anxiety and despair, and some of the same physical symptoms and manifestations of what occurred when my body was detoxing from a bender, from alcohol. And I laid there in bed and found myself unable to go to sleep, like I could not sleep when I was detoxing and going through that couple-day period of clearing alcohol and just what turns out to be an incredible amount of anxiety from my system. And it hit a point on Tuesday night and Wednesday morning where I finally realized that, Kyle, you know there's a way to get out of this. Get out of bed. You're not falling asleep. And just, it started off as just distract yourself. And so that entailed me going downstairs, grabbing a book. Sitting next to my book was the Alcoholics Anonymous book. And so I opened it up and I started reading. And the pages that I turned to were those pages that highlight and detail step 4, which is taking your personal inventory. And I'm going to use this opportunity to jump into the book and cover the content of the Alcoholics Anonymous book around step 4, as well as continue the detail out of what happened in my situation. So to the book. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. We ask ourselves why we were angry. In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships were hurt or threatened. So we were sore. We were burned up. On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal or sex relationships which had been interfered with? And there's a spot in the book where they actually detail out how to do this practice. And so I'm going to describe it here. I will highlight one example, but then I'm going to continue on because the next portion will help get us to the steps that I then took. So in the book, they have 3 columns, and the quantity there is important because there's a hidden 4th column that we'll get to in a moment here. And so the columns read, column 1, I am resentful at, column 2, the cause, and then column 3, this affects my. And so to play out the example in the book, I'm resentful at my employer, the cause. They're unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, threatens to fire me for drinking and padding my expense account. And this affects my self-esteem, self-esteem, and then in parentheses, fear and security. So then continuing on, again, with the instructions of how to take these steps. We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. The first thing apparent to us was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. So I'm going to pause there and come back to my situation. I, even in writing out and going through this practice myself, I found that my ability to take others' inventory and define and highlight and call out all of the problems that they have, they being a person, they being an institution, whatever. I was so readily able to criticize and really quite good at it and pointing out all the wrongs and all the flaws within the system and why the system was set up to fail. And the system I'm referencing right now, like why my employer's performance managed system was set up to incentivize backstabbing and ineffective delivery and like a degradation of like team morale. And I was so easily and readily able to criticize and point out all of those things. That is where my mind went first on Tuesday. And then it started playing out the pity on myself and how I got caught up in all of this madness and how it just wasn't my fault. It was out of my control and just really play out like a very pathetic, mind you, a woe is me plot in all of this. And it's just highlighted. I just want to highlight this last statement. The more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. I would fight in the past and push back and criticize, and it would lead to me drinking, to drown things out, to just, I would hit this point where I've said it in the past, is you get the fuckets as an alcoholic and you just go back to drink. And like I said, I would constantly sit there and just say, it doesn't matter, nothing matters, because I would feel so slighted by individuals or institutions or these situations that I found myself in. And I was always the one that was getting screwed. Now, I'm going to go back to the book. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile? But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of his spiritual experience, the business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. So this paragraph, I believe, before I went into rehab, if you would have read that to me or had me read it, I don't think I would have believed it. But in the course of going through rehab, and especially there was a moment during my aftercare where I was doing outpatient primarily group therapy for something like 5 hours a day, Monday through Friday. There was a few activities that we did there where, for whatever reason, I truly connected with this concept that should alcohol ever get reintroduced into my life, that is, for me, a journey to a grave. And so this last sentence, with us, to drink is to die, really is the root of why I think, as I realized where this building resentment was setting me up for in terms of going through an emotional relapse, and knowing that because I had emotionally relapsed, And I found myself back into these thought patterns and these building of resentments that I had prior to entering recovery. It made me realize that one of my guards, one of like the guardianship that I had around my ability to stay in active recovery had fallen. Now, I'm grateful that during this situation, I felt no wavering with regards to my spiritual fitness. And so I still had that with me. And through this experience, I've really come to redefine how I visualize and think about these pillars, because it's like I don't think they are three equal pillars at this point anymore. It's like I genuinely am starting to visualize it as like the spiritual and the emotional fitness and aspects of this are like the sphere, the guardians around you as the alcoholic, protecting you from the risk of physical relapse and from reintroducing alcohol into your life, and to find yourself on a path to the grave. And so I was scared. I was genuinely scared as this was going on, not only because of the situation that I faced professionally and the feedback that I had gotten on that front and the story that I was playing out in my head, but just also about what it meant to start towing up more so towards the idea and concept that like, hey, there's real risk that alcohol comes back and I don't want it. And as I said at the start, I never had the urge or desire to drink during this, but I certainly recognized that this was a situation that would have drove me to, literally driven me to the grocery store to buy alcohol. All right, back to the book and the continuation of my situation. So we turn back to the list. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? So I want to just like double down on this. This is a very extreme statement, but as I reread it in the light of the situation that I went through, I realized that I had turned over immense power, and I have turned over immense power to individuals that I don't even live in the same state as, to literally kill me by allowing a resentment to build up against an institution, against individuals. I am handing the power of my life. I am handing control of my life over to them as an alcoholic. So back to the book. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly, and we were willing to set these matters straight. So I'm going to pause here because this is kind of within the rooms of AA, this is the famous fourth column. So people will talk about, say, like their fourth step, where you're doing this inventory, or the 10th step where you're kind of on maintenance and house cleaning duty. And the fourth column often comes up. So again, the first three columns in taking your inventory is who, the second one, the cause, the third one, what it affects, and then finally the fourth one, and really the most important, and the one that drives change in perspective, the relief of resentments, is this: my contributions to the situation. And that's what this paragraph is highlighting. I'm going to read a little further, and then I'm going to circle back to my own practice of putting pen to paper for this one. So back to the book. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, which is a reference back to the examples the book showed. Back to the book. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? We reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. We asked ourselves why we had them. So with that, I'm going to quickly pivot over to just detailing what happened and what steps I took to go through this. So first thing that I want to call out, so Wednesday night, after a very sleepless night, I think I wound up getting something like 2.5 hours of sleep that night by the time I finally was able to settle down. Like I said, I knew something was going on that evening, and so I was quite frightened about the fact that I would genuinely say 80% of what I experienced on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, it is the exact same mirrored experience from when I was detoxing off of alcohol. I'm shocked by that. I never expected that to be the case. Like I said, with Lucy's situation, I'm incredibly grateful for this, but I never had a resentment. We were doing everything we possibly could for Lucy, and I was content with that. I was so lucky that I never built up any sort of anger or rage or questioning of God in this situation. And therefore, and I looked at Lucy's situation, and all I saw were people helping and wanting to help and doing their absolute best to give our daughter the best chance. It's crazy to me now going through this. It was a freaking mid-year job review, performance review, and that set me more on a path for relapse than my entire daughter's life on earth. It's shocking. The alcoholic mind it makes no sense. I'm saying this out loud and almost can't believe what I'm hearing myself. But like I said, I knew that I had tools at this point. So I got up, I read. Wednesday morning, the first thing I did was reach out to my sponsor. All I did was text him, told him I was okay. I knew I needed to walk through this step again and just ensure that I was thinking about and approaching it appropriately. So we set up a time to meet over the weekend, and between Wednesday and Sunday when we met, I worked. I worked on this resentment. I should clarify. And so it all started out by writing it down in as much detail as I could. And again, I'm going to trim this down quite a bit to make it more generalized and vague. Like, I genuinely, at this point of speaking, do not hold any resentments against anyone for this situation. Like, I look at my contributions to this, which I will get to in detail. My contributions are the root cause of all of this. Like, I set this whole situation up myself. And so here's how the steps work. Who am I holding a resentment against? My employer and my team leadership. What is the cause of these resentments? I got poor feedback on performance management. My employer is phasing out my remote work setup and situation. As a sidebar, they're highly recommending people start coming into the office, and it is starting to turn into a not very remote worker friendly situation. So the cause is them phasing out my work setup. Finally, they are setting me up to let me go at the end of the year. No question about it. I have a huge hole to dig out of right now. But again, the way that this came out and the way that it was framed in my mind when it first started occurring was I'm being set up to be let go at the end of the year. Now, what does this affect? This affects my confidence. This affects my vision of the future, and pertaining to this vision. And this is where I realized like there was some sense of unnecessary grief and mourning of loss that hasn't even occurred in this situation. And that grief and dealing with loss was with regards to all of the things that I genuinely love about this role and this job. I get to start super early in the morning. I'm a morning person. I love that. Because I start super early in the morning, I get to finish in the early afternoon. Finishing my workday in the early afternoon allows me to do things around the house, kind of like make sure we're set up with all of the aspects of just, running a family. And it also gives me the ability to pick up Grant every single day from daycare. And then Grant and I get time together in the late afternoon before Alyssa gets home, and I cherish this time with him. I was going through the process of mourning the loss of that ability without actually having experienced that. And then finally, this affects my financial stability, or I should say our financial stability. Of course, the fragility of our system is oftentimes overlooked, and we're in an economy and in a situation where it's like this can happen at any point. But boy, when you're just kind of clocking in and out every single day, it sure doesn't feel like it. And all of that, again, you reflect back on it and see where fear is the underlying motive or driver for a vast majority of those aspects to this. And then finally, my fourth column, and quite frankly, the column that I could not get to until Saturday. It genuinely still took me, knowing that I had tools and having this be the only real resentment crop up in my life, it still took me over 3 days to get to the point where I could genuinely put down my contributions to this situation. So here they are. My contributions are, I did not understand how performance management works with my employer. I assumed that it operated one way, and because I assumed it worked that way, what ended up happening is I failed to give my manager, my direct manager, the absolute most compelling slam dunk arguments to argue and fight for me on my behalf during this performance management review process. Another contribution that I had, I flat out underperformed. I know that I fell far below my potential in this first 6-month period. There's just no excuses for that. I can genuinely look back at the last 6 months, and it is kind of laughable the lack of accomplishments that I had in a job that I should be able to knock out a fair amount of deliverables and a fair amount of recognizable accomplishments. Finally, my contribution to this is I flat out refuse to relocate or move for my job. This is something that I have taken to heart after a move that I did in the past, luckily for a short term, for a job to a place that I absolutely hated. And it wound up turning into a core part of my value structure that I will not sacrifice a living situation for a role or a job. And where my employer is pushing and pulling people back into, I will not move. And so, yes, the company is taking a stance that they are whittling down and cutting out on these remote role opportunities, but it is my decision to not move for this job. So again, these are my major contributions to this resentment. And I want to acknowledge like a ton of this, basically all of this, all of what I've just talked about here in the last 30 or so minutes is like really elementary stuff. Like you should be able to explain this and see this practice in a 7-year-old. I'm going to acknowledge that. But the aspect of fighting and living with alcoholism is that we have this mind that is so powerful at building these resentments, figuring out how to manipulate and get back at people. That's an aspect of this that I haven't even gotten into, and I kind of elected not to get into because it is like shocking and really ugly how quickly my mind went into manipulation and revenge mode. And that's part of the frightening aspect of this, is just this crazy combination of the ability to build a resentment and play out this manipulative scheme to get back at these people that you've built a resentment up against. And just standing here talking through this, I'm entirely grateful that it only took me a week. I mean 3 days. Like I said, it was Saturday by the time I like really felt good and straightened out from this situation, and like I genuinely was not holding resentments or grudges. But in the past, again, this would have been harbored. This would have been more heaps and piles in my mess of a house. To wrap up here, I'm going to go back to the book, the conclusion of the 4th step in taking personal inventory. So to the book. If we have been thorough about our personal inventory, we have written down a lot. We have listed and analyzed our resentments. We have begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. We have commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We have begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill toward all men, even our enemies. So, with that, I am going to wrap this one up by just again saying how frightening this situation was to find myself in, to realize that so much of what I experienced, again, thought patterns, anxiety, as well as some physical manifestations and sensations, all of that which I experienced during detox, how much of it was actually driven by my emotional stability and strength. And it just really drives a point home to me that this truly is progress that we're working towards. I don't know that I will ever be able to handle a situation like this perfectly live on the spot. I'm going to continue working and doing my best to get there, but it truly is a process, and I can just say how grateful, how lucky, and how thankful I am that despite all of this, I had no urge, no desire to drink. So I think that's all I've got for this week. Take care. Love y'all. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others or give us a rating on your channel of choice. My hope is that my story can help others in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life that they feel could be bettered. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. I cannot solve your problems for you, but I can listen. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and life is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you have to endure. Until next time.